The final tribe that I'll be covering in this video is the Lombards, a Germanic tribe. They were a subgroup of the aforementioned Suebi, who would later give their name to the Kingdom of Lombardy, now perhaps more famously a city in Italy. The Lombards are a people hailing originally from Scandinavia, and the term Lombard is actually a shortening of Longobardi, quite literally long beards. However, this was not their original name. That was the Vinili, meaning the wolves, and they were said to be the worshippers of the Vanir rather than the Aesir. It's worthy of note, before we continue, that the term Vanir is thought to share the same Indo-European root as the Roman goddess Venus, both stemming from the Indo-European word Venos, meaning desire, which is fitting given the attachments to fertility and love that are evident with both Venus and the Vanir. The Vanir are thought by some to be the deities worshipped by the ancient Nordic peoples before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, part of the agricultural mother goddess cult, and the myths of the Lombards may support this idea. In fact, the Germanic people as a whole were said to venerate, the word venerate also coming from the Indo-European word Venos, by the way, a goddess called Nerthus, thought to be Mother Earth herself. However, we have little writings of Nerthus, and she does not appear in any Nordic or Germanic mythology, only in the writings of Tacitus. Many believe that Nerthus may be one of the Vanir, perhaps the wife of Njordis, the Germanic god of the sea. However, with such scant records and rather a lot of ambiguity, it can be difficult to discern her true identity. But Tacitus tells us of the Lombards and of their partaking in the worship of Mother Earth. By contrast, the Longobardi are distinguished by being few in number. Surrounded by many mighty peoples, they have protected themselves not by submissiveness, but by battle and boldness. Next to them come the Rudingi, Aviones, Anglos, Verini, Eudoces, Suarenes, and Heutones, protected by river and forests. There is nothing especially noteworthy about these tribes individually, but they are distinguished by a common worship of Nerthus, that is, Mother Earth, and beliefs that she intervenes in human affairs and rides through their peoples. There is a sacred grove on an island in the ocean, on which there is a consecrated chariot, draped with cloth, which the priest alone may touch. He perceives the presence of the goddess in the innermost shrine, and with great reverence escorts her in her chariot, which is drawn by female cattle. There are days of rejoicing then, and the countryside celebrates the festival, wherever she decides to visit and accept hospitality. No one goes to war, no one takes up arms, all objects of iron are locked away. Then, and only then, do they experience peace and quiet. Only then do they prize them, until the goddess has had her fill of human society, and the priest brings her back to her temple. Afterwards the chariot, the cloth, and, if one may believe it, the deity herself are washed in a hidden lake. The slaves who perform this office are immediately swallowed up in the same lake. Hence arises dread of the mysterious, and piety, which keeps them ignorant of what only those about to perish may see. Whether or not Tacitus is telling the truth regarding the drowning of slaves who partake in the ceremony, since such things are a common feature of not only propaganda, but Tacitus's infamous love of good storytelling, it is clear that the Germanic peoples held Mother Earth in very high regard. Regarding this idea of a cult of Mother Earth, it is perhaps for this reason that the Lombards, still known as the Vinili at this point, held the goddess Frigg, the wife of Odin, as their patron and protector in their war against the Vandals, who looked to Odin instead. Rather uniquely amongst many of the Germanic peoples, we have records of who they were and how they supposedly got their name. These are preserved in the 7th century book Origo Gentis Langobardorium. The book tells of their origin in Scandinavia and begins with their war against the Vandals. It might have become clear by this point, but unfortunately it would seem that only Europeans could test the strength of other Europeans, at least in their prime, and the Germanic peoples would unfortunately be infighting for centuries. Without wishing to sound depressing, it would seem that the Germanic infighting would never cease even into the modern day, with the Anglo-Saxons and their mainland brothers having been at one another's throats for centuries. Even now, a fierce and pointless rivalry still exists. The Lombards would also refuse to join Arminius in his campaign against the Romans, and would later go to war with him. They even helped restore the pro-Roman king of the Cherusci, Arminius' tribe, after he had already been deposed by the Cherusci themselves due to his pro-Roman sentiments. The Germanic conflict with Rome is, like many wars throughout history, especially those involving the Germanic peoples, not as black and white as we've been led to believe by the media, mainstream historians, and of course, the Netflix series. Unfortunately, these wars often involved Germanic brothers spilling one another's blood, but as a people forged in war, this often came naturally to them. If the Germanic peoples had truly united, be that under Arminius or under Rome, then as history has proven, they would have been unstoppable. We can only hope for such a reconciliation in the future, and for the Germanic people, and European peoples as a whole, to unite against these many threats that currently plague our people. But, as we have spoken of in previous episodes, war is the womb of the nation. It forges and moulds a people, it makes them strong, and hardens their sense of national purpose and identity. The Lombards were no different, and, like almost all other Indo-European peoples, their identity was forged by the gods in the tempering heat of battle. It was said that when the Vanilli had become overpopulated, 1/3 of their population migrated out into the lands ruled by the Vandals, who then demanded tribute from the Vanilli. Despite being outnumbered, they refused, deciding instead to fight rather than submit. The chronicle of their origin contains the quote, "It is better to maintain liberty by arms than to stain it by the payment of tribute." The Vandals sought help from Odin, who promised victory to the first side he saw at sunrise. The queen of the Vanilli sought help instead from Frigg, who told the vastly outnumbered Vanilli to have their women tie their hair in front of their faces and march disguised in the ranks of the men, making them appear far larger in number. She then turned her husband's bed to face the Vanilli. When Odin awoke, he saw the marching Vanilli and asked his wife, "Who are these long beards?" Frigg then responded, "My lord, you have given them their name. Now give them also their victory." Odin granted this, and from then on the Vanillis were known by all as the Long Beards, Lombards. One other theory that modern scholars have given is that they took the name from Lombarda, one of the names of Odin, and that when the tribe began to take on a lifestyle of active warfare and conquest, they elevated Odin to the head of their pantheon, replacing the agricultural mother goddess. A similar thing is also thought to have occurred with Odin and Tyr in the Scandinavian traditions, so it isn't unheard of. One interesting thing, however, is the name that these Lombards had for Odin. They called him Godan, thought to be related to the divine progenitor of the Gothic peoples, the demigod Gaut, or Gautir, the latter being a title that just means god of the Goths, sometimes used for Odin as well, though when referring to Odin the term is often the elder Gautir, so as to distinguish him from his demigod son. These two names are the origin of the English word God, as the early Christian missionaries setting out to preach to the Germanic tribes came from the Lombardic kingdom, which controlled Rome for some time. The Lombards were therefore heavily preached to by the missionaries, and despite stubborn resistance well into the 7th century, wherein pagan rituals were still being performed by these Lombards, they eventually converted to Christianity, partially due to the subversive tactics used by these missionaries. The original translators of the Bible from Latin into the Germanic languages spoken by the Lombards, the Saxons, and others struggled to find a direct translation for the word Deus, which, as we know, was already a subversion of the familiar Indo-European word Deus. The word that they settled on was, rather surprisingly to modern ears, Wodan for the Saxons and Godan for the Lombards. Wodan was shortened to Wod, and Godan was shortened to God. And by these means, the pagans were effectively duped into worshipping foreign gods, thinking that they were merely honouring their own highest deity in a new way, especially since many would not have even been literate enough to read the texts of their newly adopted religion. In fact, the earliest use of the word God is in the Gothic Bible, written in the 4th century, at least 300 years before the Lombards would abandon their own traditions. Despite the fact that the Lombards would remain loyal to their gods and the customs of their ancestors for so long, the Lombard Catholic monk, Paul the Deacon, would write in the late 7th century that the pagan customs of his people and their history were ridiculous and laughable. An example of how quickly a man can be taught to hate his own traditions and scorn his own ancestors when his head is relentlessly pumped full of foreign ideas. Though, with that said, some men are simply born traitors, and regarding their own people with contempt seems to come naturally to them. Now, that just about concludes my section of this episode. The Lombards are a fitting end to this first part, as they bridge the gap between the Nordic peoples, the mainland Germanics, and the modern British. For now, I'd like to hand over to my co-host Nestor, so that he might speak about the formation and origin of the Athenians and their political systems, and clear up some of the lies and misconceptions surrounding it.